Oh, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us, whatever time it is, wherever you are. I couldn't be happier to introduce Dr. Lottie Riches. Lottie is a consultant psychiatrist, and I'm really, really excited to hear what she has to say. I'm not going to say anything else because, yeah, I just can't wait to hear her ideas. So Lottie, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks for asking me to be here and giving me this time to talk. So I wanted just to start really by acknowledging how much pressure there is on young people today and on teachers and parents. And so I wanted to share a model that's a way of thinking about our human emotions, how we react under stress, and what we can do about it. And I think it links to something I know that is close to your heart, which is flourishing, because this can help us think about how we can be the best version of ourselves, and how we can activate a more compassionate orientation for ourselves and others. So I just thought I'd start with a model and maybe give a few examples, and then we can think about maybe how to apply it depending on how much time we get. So the model is called the 3 circles model, and it's from the compassionate mind approach by Professor Paul Gilbert, but others too have contributed to that. To start by explaining the model, I actually want to take us back to evolution and think about the priorities as far as evolution is concerned, because this is really relevant to our emotions and the challenges we have when we're trying to search for mental well-being today. So our nervous systems have evolved with the targets of reproduction and survival, not well-being. Okay, so we've developed systems that help us really rapidly scan and detect for threats and respond to the threat, to be motivated to seek out resources, and to be motivated to care for our young and our kin, because we're mammals and we have dependent infants. So we're going to start with the kind of the oldest and in many ways the strongest system, which is our threat protection system. Now, it's worth saying from the outset that our brains have a bias towards safety. They have a better safe than sorry kind of skew. So if there's a potential threat, our brain will divert its energy towards threat protection and actually send some of our higher brain functions offline. Okay, so this makes sense if we think back to our ancestral times and think about the types of threats we might have met. If we meet a hungry lion, we need to prioritize survival and not waste energy on complex perceptions and creativity and imagination. It's better to shut those functions off actually and prioritize energy towards survival. The problem with this is that we're going to, the problem with the better safe than sorry approach is that we're going to sometimes activate threat quite unnecessarily. In fact, we do that quite a lot as humans. And also these responses were designed with different types of threats to that which we commonly encounter now. So good for a hungry lion, bad for exam stress, for example. And we'll go on to explain why so in a little bit. Okay, so so we've got these evolutionary priorities. Reproduction, survival, doesn't really care about well-being too much. We haven't evolved out of our old survival-based brain, and our threat systems are really easily activated, and our brain will prioritize survival and actually shut off some of our kind of higher thinking brain.
Brilliant. And Lottie, I love that. That's so interesting. Do you think you could go into a bit more detail on what actually happens if our brain detects a threat?
Okay, so our brains are always scanning, or our nervous systems actually are always scanning for potential threats. We've got 2 clusters of cells in our temporal lobes. These are called our amygdalae, which have a central role here, although it's more complicated than just them. But if they detect a potential threat, they signal to our hypothalamus, and that initiates our acute stress reaction. And we'll all know that as our fight-flight response. So we then release hormones that produce mobilizing responses and reduce body pain and sensory awareness. We also, from our amygdalae, activate a survival-based emotion, something like fear, disgust, anger. And those emotions are intended to act as messages, making us act to get ourselves safer, so to run away or repel something toxic or fight, for example. So we'll notice that we start to get physiological changes, our heart rate will go up, our breathing rate will go up, we're preparing our muscles to potentially, and our attention changes and it narrows onto the potential source of threat. So we get a kind of tunnel vision actually. So this is really useful if we're back in that situation with a hungry lion, because we have tunnel vision onto the lion, we're super perceptive about the lion, our muscles are prepared to move, and our pain is dampened down, which might be handy. But it's not so useful if we need to think or problem solve, and quite a lot of the threats that we face today do require us to be able to think and problem solve. So, you know, one thing that I would say that's really important practically, don't expect people to problem solve while they're highly anxious or agitated. They just can't do it. So help them get calmer first, you know, bring their level of emotional arousal down, and then they'll be able to see the solutions. They can't see it otherwise. So that's fight, flight, and lots of people, you know, can recognize that in their body. They've had experience of that. However, if the threat is something very imminent, very overwhelming, something where we're helpless, we can't, you know, running or fighting is just not an option, then there'll be a very, very, very brief moment of sympathetic and parasympathetic activation, and then a parasympathetic response will take over, and that creates immobilized responses. So freeze or submit or fawn type responses. We get numb emotionally and physically. We're less able to speak or make voluntary muscle movements, and our information processing changes. So how we're able to take in information, how we lay down memory, how we're able to integrate information and be clear about where it's coming from actually is altered. And we think that might have some relevance in psychosis experiences, for example. So at its most extreme, that's playing dead, kind of freeze immobilized response. But we see really, really subtle variations of it too. So somebody, for example, who's had repeated experiences of being overwhelmed or traumatized in a situation where they can't find a way out, might just start to go numb and switch off their ability to feel, because it's easier for them to function and they're less in pain and distress if they just don't feel. Now, there are things that we can do to widen that range, you know, widen our emotional tolerance between overwhelm and freeze, to make that wider window where we can feel emotions but not become overwhelmed. And that's not for today, but that's something called the window of tolerance. And if anyone's interested, Prof. Dan Siegel is worth reading on that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lottie. And two brilliant practical tips there, especially like the one about helping people calm down before you expect them to problem solve, because it's so tempting in a classroom situation or with your family. You've got a really agitated young person and you're expecting them to find a solution to the fact they're having a massive argument with their brother, and they can't possibly do that. So actually taking that time to help them calm down, same with our spouses, you know, maybe something's gone wrong and they're really stressed or agitated about it, and yet we're trying to ask them for a solution. So I think that's so helpful. Thank you, so useful. And yeah, lovely recommendation to Dan Siegel too. His work is amazing, so that's brilliant. And so it sounds like our threat system causes us some problems.
Yes, it certainly does, although we do need it, but yes, it certainly does. So we have to kind of remember the context in which we evolved, and what might have constituted a threat to our ancestors. So evolution is slow and it's flawed. You know, we can't go back and correct design flaws. We just have to evolve on top of what we've already got to some extent. And we haven't evolved out of this old survival-based brain. So to our ancestors, ejection from a group, rejection by a group, that would have been a genuine threat to an ancestor's survival, for example. So nowadays, you know, we still have a brain that recognizes that kind of situation as a threat, but we're exposed to far larger groups, you know, far more groups, far larger groups with shifting membership, often online. And that means that we're potentially exposed all the time to lots and lots of opportunities to worry that we're not acceptable or good enough, or that we're going to be in some way rejected. And we can easily get into a cycle where we're driven, understandably, to seek validation or approval online, or connection online, but then actually get into spirals of anxiety or shame about other people's reactions when there's often no filter. So online expression and validation can be really useful for some people. I'm not saying it's not positive up to a point, because it can be, but it is just exposing us to, on the one hand, the risk of rejection, invalidation, disapproval, whatever. And on the other hand, approval of validation, but then that's kind of quite addictive. We kind of, need more and more and more, and it becomes, almost a bit like an addiction, actually. Instead of us learning how to self-validate, which is a really important life skill from kind of my perspective as a psychiatrist. So I would say it's really helpful to think about teaching young people how to self-validate, particularly if they're prone to feeling invalidated, or if they're going through something that's hard for other people to understand, or if they're in a boarding school where they haven't got that family on hand noticing what's going on for them all the time. So we have to kind of think about threat in the context in which our brains and nervous systems involved. Now, the other tricky thing about being human, which is a somewhat similar point, is that our threat systems can get activated not just by real or actual threats, but by perceived or imagined threat. So if you just imagine failing an exam, you're setting off your threat response. If you remember something painful, if you remember something where you felt ashamed or embarrassed or something, you're activating your threat response. Or if you remember something or imagine something. So it's to do with how we lay down memory when we're in a traumatic situation or a stressful situation, and also to do with something called cognitive fusion. But it does mean that we have these very tricky minds that can get us into loops of worry or fear when there's actually not a threat happening. So our minds are really super powerful, and we can use this to our advantage. We can imagine something, relaxing or happy. We can use guided meditation, for example, to help actually calm our nervous system and evoke positive emotion. But unfortunately, because of that better safe than sorry skew, we tend to go towards the negative more easily and get ourselves in loops where we're activating threat all the time when actually nothing's happened. And then what I see clinically a lot, I guess, is some of the challenges that we see when people have repeatedly experienced threat or overwhelming stress, trauma, whatever it is, and that kind of kindles the threat system and makes it a bit harder, but I won't go into that today.
Oh, thank you so much. And I love the idea that we do have the power. Our brains, we can have some control and we can feel empowered, but actually to be really self-compassionate because the threat response is so strong and because we're biased to that. So I think there are two really important things for us to take away: that A, we do have a lot of power with our brains, we can take ourselves to a better place, but that if we can't get there, not to beat ourselves up and add an extra layer of guilt and worry and rumination because we are wired that way. I think that's really encouraging. Thank you. And
I think that's super valid, Katie. And I'd say it's really important, because if you are in for example, a state where you're feeling quite low or quite anxious, it's going to be harder to activate that kind of more soothing response. So definitely don't focus on whether or not you get there. The act of trying will in itself be helpful if you keep doing it. So, just remember the act of trying is going to be good.
Wow, that's really encouraging as well, actually. And and that's so reassuring as well, because actually, as you say, when you are anxious, it's so hard to self-soothe and get yourself to a better state. But if we know that the act of trying is helpful for our body and mind, then actually, I think that's really encouraging and reassuring too. Thank you. Oh, love that. And Lottie, I'm really curious, how can we tell if our threat system has been activated?
Yeah, so at its extreme, it may be really obvious. We may be in a state of high anxiety, agitation, near panic, for example, but it can be really subtle. And it can depend a little bit whether we tend to go to that kind of more mobilized fight-flight response, or whether we tend to go to a kind of shut down, immobilized type response. So you may notice quite a subtle change in the attention, someone zoning out or just not being able to take something in as they normally might. So I don't know if it's helpful. I could share an example. I was in a clinic appointment with a patient and a support worker, and the support worker was super kind and trying to be really helpful, but said something that was very triggering. Didn't know she said something triggering. And the client appeared kind of okay on the surface, but something really subtle changed in the interaction and the engagement. And I thought, oh, we've kind of lost her. I don't know, but it was very subtle. But anyway, we sort of went back through it afterwards, and although it seemed very subtle to me, the change in kind of the quality of engagement, she was a bit more zoned out. Actually, she can't remember anything from that point on in the consultation, so it seemed very subtle to me, but actually it was real, you know.
Wow.
So yeah, the level of attention can change. A change in body sensation, because we often remember things in our body as well as mind. Or a feeling that seems to come out of nowhere, which might be an emotional memory that the amygdala is activated. An urge to act, to do something, or just becoming more impulsive, or a craving. So it can show up in lots of different, sometimes really obvious and sometimes actually quite subtle ways. And over time, depending on what we experience repeatedly, we adapt and we develop our own ways of coping to threats. And sometimes those are really healthy, helpful ways of coping, but often not. Often they have their own sort of downsides, and sometimes that's going to show up as mental health symptoms or symptoms of mental illness. So if you want to dig into that any more deeply, then you could go to the BPS, the British Psychological Society's publication, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is a way of thinking about symptoms as actually adaptations to stress, for example. So that might look like us becoming hypervigilant, or having tension in our body, muscle aches, headaches, developing problems with sleep, perceiving neutral acts as aggressive, rapidly becoming aggressive or defensive, rapidly shutting down, going numb, not being able to feel, detaching, fostering a sense of control through eating or hoarding, or anything really, to be honest. Avoiding emotion through alcohol, drugs, shopping, binge eating, gambling, our phone, scrolling. Lots of possibilities. And I'm not saying all those are bad, by the way, and I'm not saying all of those are unhealthy coping mechanisms. It's just about, you know, the extent and whether they do us, you know, whether they help us or not overall. So essentially it's about saying, actually, we have got these tricky minds, and we do have to cope inevitably with stress in lives, and we develop ways of adapting to that, and sometimes those adaptations are helpful and sometimes we need to kind of address them because they actually do us more harm than good. Now, I think what people often don't appreciate, or maybe that's my experience, but organizations can start adapting too. So an organisation under chronic pressure or overwhelm can start to behave in ways that try to deny or avoid the distress, or reduce the sense of threat through becoming very over-controlling or rigid, for example. So in mental health services, which is obviously my background, we've seen this a lot. We've had years of efficiency savings, that's cut, and at the same time as increasing demand, and that's kind of created this state of chronic overwhelm. So to try and protect the service from this overwhelm, you know, managers of the service often devise ways of trying to cope using gatekeeping, like thresholds and criteria, which are kind of reasonable and legitimate up to a point, but they easily get translated by overwhelmed people into rigidity, and a complete loss of focus on the person and their individual needs. Which then translates to lots of people being invalidated or excluded or not helped until they're really, really severe, which actually drives up the demand. So it becomes a really vicious cycle. And I don't work in education, but I imagine you're a very, very busy, context, and I imagine that you probably see organisations developing their own stress responses too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so right. Cuts, certainly. And then the pressure of inspections, really, really problematic, and the pressure of results as well, which again, like you're saying, it takes the focus away from the people, because it's much easier to just focus on numbers than actually what's going on with individual students or individual teachers or individual staff who are working, you know, within that. So yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. But Lottie, what can we do about all this? How can we mitigate?
Stop the inspections. No, if only, right?
Yes.
Yeah, there's obviously not a single simple answer, but I mean, firstly, I think you actually made reference to it earlier. We've got to kind of have empathy or self-compassion. For this is genuinely tricky. We will get activated by things like inspections, you know, and we will respond to that. But if we can step back and make sense of some of those responses, it takes some of the fear and power out of it, and it also shows us either what we need, where to start when it feels a bit overwhelming, or what not to do. So on an individual basis, for example, if a person is using a lot of strategies to try and increase their sense of control, then we really need to be careful not to go in and make them feel more powerless and take away even more control, which is genuinely hard, because if you've got a situation like an eating disorder, for example, they might be feeling more in control when they don't eat, but you know, the anxiety, which is completely valid, about the dangerous level of thinness and starvation might mean that people, you know, become very clamped down and say, you know, we've got to become very controlling around this person. So it's, how do we find balance in situations like that? How do we try and get to the anxiety or psychological pain underneath the need for control? In an organization, again, I think it's really important to think, you know, when we're in threat mode, we tend to be very reactive. It's less easy to think and reflect, actually. So how do we get people out of that threat defensive mindset and back into a more reflective, compassionate state? And that's genuinely hard. But at least if we can make sense of what's going on in the organisation, and we know how to activate soothe, which will balance out threats, then we've got a better idea of what not to do. Which is usually what people do. So, for example, I worked in an organisation that had experienced lots of different traumas, actually, and high stress and overwhelm for many years. And a particular bit of that organisation had become very
Hi, Katie.
Yeah, we just got a bit of a freeze issue. Hopefully it'll come back in a sec. Thank you.
Hey, I'm back. Sorry, you froze and then I went.
Fantastic. Thank you. Brilliant. Brilliant.
We're here now.
Awesome.
So yes, we won't read anything into why we suddenly got cut off. In an education setting, you could think, you know, you can anticipate certain threats like inspection, for example, or exams, and think, okay, so we need to think, how on any more pressure. So that's threat, but I feel like I'm giving you all the bad news. So let's move on to the second system, which is your drive system. This is the system that's about needing to seek out and acquire resources to be able to reproduce and survive. That's the sort of context. So to survive and reproduce, we need to go out and find food, shelter, a mate, and so on. And our drive system is the emotion regulation system that gives us the urges to do this and provides the positive reinforcement via dopamine from acquiring things. So it's like threat, it's an activating system, but it's not about threat defense, it's about achieving and acquiring. Which
Is that good? Is that good?
Yeah, it is good up to a point. We definitely need it, but it's how that interacts with our very overstimulating and competitive world, really. So that's potentially problematic for us, and our drive system can be really easily dysregulated. So again, if we go back to thinking like an ancestor, we evolved in a time of relative resource scarcity. We didn't evolve in a time of excess sugar, advertising, marketing, Amazon, etc. So we now have access to lots of comparison and competition, and we get an instant dopamine hit from buying and consuming things that make us feel good, which makes it more likely that we're going to repeat that behavior just through reinforcement, right? So it's genuinely challenging for us to maintain balance in the system. So like you said, you've got to be self-compassionate for how easy how hard it is to self-soothe when you're anxious. We've got to be self-compassionate too. It's kind of hard to step outside that kind of get more kind of drive. When this system is in balance, we've got healthy levels of energy, motivation, pleasure, and ideas. So that's good. But when it's out of balance, we might be unmotivated and lacking in energy, or full of unrealistic ideas and over-energized. And sadly, quite a lot of us now cycle between various versions of striving and then slightly burning out. But in my context, it can be useful to think about the drive system dysregulation when we're thinking about things like addiction and bipolar. So what I was thinking what would be relevant for your context, and I think it's worth mentioning something to do with the threat and drive systems and how they can interrelate. I think it's relevant to how we raise young people. So we do live in a society where there are lots of messages telling us that we could do more, achieve more, acquire more, where comparison and competition are pretty much promoted, and where we're defined in quite a large part actually by what we do and what we have. And we may also have our own individual experiences of having high expectation on us, or lots of pressure or criticism from others, or even from within ourselves. And we, unsurprisingly, often develop core fears about not being good enough, or we link our worth to achievement rather than a wider picture of worth. And that often drives coping responses such as, having unrelenting standards, excessive striving, and perfectionism. Now, it's good to be driven up to a point, don't get me wrong. It's just when we start to see failure as catastrophic, or where we really link our worth to success, that we make ourselves quite vulnerable. So in essence, our drive system gets a bit hijacked in the service of threat defense. We drive ourselves to achieve or be perfect in the hope we can avoid this horrible feeling of threat from failure or worthlessness. And this often works, and you might be really successful at it for a while, up to a point, but it tends to be pretty tricky to sustain. So at some point, we'll all still fail, and we'll all be able to, we'll all just struggle to keep up such an unrelenting pace. And then when we start to think we're failing or we can't keep up the pace, we actually activate our threat system. That forces us back into overdrive to try and redeem our self-worth by doing better once again. So this horrible sort of cycling between threat and drive, which is exhausting. So you might be successful at it up for a number of years, but if you don't find a way of balancing it, then often exhaustion, burnout, depression, anxiety, drug, alcohol abuse, or physical illness tend to be the consequences, which is not a great list. Balance is important. And I think something that's really important for schools, and I'm not sure how you do it, but I think teaching ourselves that failure is inevitable and kind of safe and kind of okay is actually really important. So I personally use a mantra that I'm really sorry, I don't know who said it, but it was you win or you learn, and it's not mine, but I think that's really helpful. That's something I use, but we need to kind of decatastrophize failure. So then there's the soothe system, which is the good news. So this system, linked to our attachment system, allows us to care for others, to feel cared about, to feel connected and to want to connect, to have a real sense of common humanity, and to feel contented and a sense of safeness. Now, safeness is kind of not really a word, but I think it now is. And what I mean by safeness is not having to kind of retreat or restrict ourselves to be safe through avoiding risk or failure or whatever, but actually feeling safe to go out and face the world, knowing that we can kind of cope if we fail, that we're okay. And the feeling of contentment is linked to a hormone, oxytocin, which is the hormone you get after giving birth and through breastfeeding, which allows you to contemplate having a second child. But it's also produced via contact with loved ones, animals, but also eating. So comfort eating exists for a reason. So we see disturbed oxytocin functioning in mental illnesses, trauma, and certain physical conditions, actually. So activating our soothe system allows us to be at our most compassionate, kind, creative, and it's linked to mental well-being and resilience in lots of really important ways, actually. So, you know, this system is good, and we can build our ability to feel soothed and to, you know, to calm our nervous systems in lots of different ways, mostly all very easily accessible. Ancient practices, for example, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, tai chi, spending time in contact with nature, or having time, you know, in contact with the earth, spending time with loved ones. But we can also train our minds. You know, we can do compassionate mind training and actually really enhance our ability to use this system. And it's very responsive to kindness. If we want to activate someone else's soothe system, then being kind is a great starting point. Yes, if anyone's interested, the Compassionate Mind Foundation website has lots of free resources with the Compassionate Mind training examples on there. So, you know, it's an easy place to go and start something up. So in an education setting, you know, I think I would imagine your pupils are under a huge amount of stress. So I think it's really important to think, okay, how can we help them find balance? You know, we can't necessarily always remove all the stresses. Some we might be able to control and we might be able to help them prepare for, but how can we balance this through activities that are going to be self-soothing and calming and just activate that feeling of contentment and soothed? And how can we help them make sense of their responses to stress, you know, whether that's emotional, behavioral responses, because just that process of making sense is calming in itself. And maybe avoid, so I heard of a school that, for example, there was a concern, I think through a counsellor or school, somebody to do with pastoral care or well-being in the school flagged up concerns. Oh my goodness, all the people seem really, really stressed at the minute. It was exams, and the response was, okay, well, we're not allowed to call exams anymore. We have to call them something else, which probably isn't going to help. You know, they still know, and actually it's just a kind of, all you're teaching them there is to sort of deny or avoid the source of the stress, really, to kind of turn away from it and pretend it doesn't really isn't really there. And then another response was that I heard about was just teach them time management so they can revise more. And again, I was like, oh my goodness, they don't have to learn another thing right now. They're already really, really maxed out. And actually, again, it's balanced. You know, if they're having to spend a lot of time revising, how can you also create opportunities in their day to do things that are not pressured, that are about just, you know, having time out from the pressure, not having to learn anything, and just calming and making sure they get enough restorative sleep, for example. Anyway, I'm sure you all do amazing things that I don't even know about.
Brilliant. So if those are the three systems, Lottie, how do they connect with each other?
Yeah, so that's the main point, I think. So it's really important to understand that they dynamically relate. So we can help regulate our threat and our drive systems through soothe. Okay, so unfortunately the reverse is true. If we're in a very threat sensitive, competitive mindset, that's going to impede our compassionate responding. So our challenge today, as I see it, is to shift increasingly from this mind orientation of threat, defense and competition and achievement to collaboration and compassion. And frankly, many of our global challenges really need us to make that shift. And there are lots of valid fears about doing that. You know, people sort of worry that if we take away our drive, or if we somehow regulate our drive, we'll all become really unmotivated and unproductive. Or if we remove our sense of threat through shame, for example, we'll all start behaving terribly. But these don't really play out in reality. We do need all three systems. You know, they all have a part to play, but the main target's balance. And often for us, that means regulating our threat and drive through more soothe. It's been interesting with COVID, actually, to think about these three circles in action. So lots of people had very different experience in COVID, so I don't want to, I'm generalizing here and that's going to be flawed, but just for the purpose of the example. So during COVID, most of us were exposed to more threat activating messages. There was a lot of fear around, there was a lot of uncertainty around, it was all very unprecedented. So our threat systems were often more activated. Then in terms of drive, we had less access. We weren't allowed to go out and do the things that we enjoy, to give us pleasure and motivation. And we were also asked to do the impossible, to perform lots and lots of different roles at once. For example, work, homeschool, parent, and adapt to loads of significant changes in our lives. So our threat and drive tended to be a bit dysregulated. And then our soothe access was a bit cut off too. We couldn't usually spend time with as many loved ones or friends, and quite a lot of people had less time to rest and to self-care. So unsurprisingly, as a result, we saw increased anxiety and coping mechanisms, which were often linked to trying to control that anxiety. So we saw increases in things like eating disorder or OCD. Now, some people flourished because the pressure and expectation was lifted actually in some ways for some people, particularly during the first lockdown. That wasn't preserved, unfortunately, by the later lockdowns. We'd all gone completely crazy and normalised an expectation that you could work, homeschool and parent all at the same time. But anyway, so some people are now, who felt that the pressure was taken off in lockdown, for example. Some are now really struggling with anxiety as they try to resume roles that they'd had to give up for a while. And there's nothing like avoiding something that you find anxiety provoking to make your anxiety worse. And I think that's really relevant for schools as well. With exams, it's a lot harder if you've had a break from graded exams and so on. It's really, really anxiety provoking when you go back to it. So that's just, you can use COVID as an example of kind of 3 emotion regulation systems in action.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we can relate to all of those, especially like we are seeing so much anxiety in our poor year 11s and 13s because they're just not used to taking exams, especially the year 13s, because it's really high stakes for them. So I think that's such a valid point and one that we really need to kind of bear in mind. But how would you say we can help ourselves, Lottie?
So we have got these brains that tend towards threats, and we have got brains that can be shaped by negative experiences, but we can also use that to the in an opposite. So we can expose ourselves to repeated positive experiences. We can make use of our mind's ability to alter its state of emotional arousal. We can make use of neuroplasticity to alter the function and structure of our brains. And these are often through things that aren't necessarily easy to do, but actually if we do them repeatedly will be beneficial for us. So training our minds to be present, or returning awareness to the present, not what's necessarily going on in our head, is important. Moderate aerobic exercise can be helpful, can increase neuroplasticity. Self-compassion training, definitely putting in a plug for that. So we can actually learn to self-regulate our attention, our emotions, and our behavioural responses to triggers. It's not easy. I say it like it's easy. It's not, but it's possible. And for our young people, I think it's really important we think about what we're modelling, and that we, model how to foster well-being, and think about how to help them manage the inherently competitive and pressured nature of education alongside all the other pressures growing up.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yeah, quite terrifying, but some useful, positive things there. And I'm wondering, could you expand a little bit on how this might apply in education? Yeah,
so I guess I'm thinking how to foster compassion and balance. And I think that you guys will all know better than I, because I'm not a teacher. But my thoughts would be along these lines. So I'd go back to the 3 circles, and then I'd probably say, do something practical. Use, so I sometimes use something called the cold learning or reflective cycle. I gave you a diagram, actually, Katie. You might want to share it if you want, but it's just a simple tool. Just helps to have a diagram, I find. So I would think, just step back regularly and say, how, so you start at the what bit, what are the threats? How is threats operating in the school? What threats are we under from outside our school unit? By unit I mean department, team, school, whatever level you're setting it at. So that might be, regulation, inspection. What threats are we under within our team or unit? And then what do we need to contain our stress and anxiety about these things, so that we're okay, but also so that we don't pass that anxiety down the line. We really don't want that being passed down the line to other teachers or to pupils, for example. What do we need to keep functioning healthily ourselves despite these threats? And are we just reflecting, are we adapting, are we responding to these threats in ways that aren't actually that helpful, like spending hours and hours and hours preparing for an inspection and not actually spending that time on other things that might actually improve the quality of the service or whatever. That tends to be a big one. So if we are doing something that's understandable but maybe not that helpful, how do we step back from that? So I do it kind of for threats, and then I would also do it for power in a school context, because it's true of health as well, but there's massive power issues in health, and I think in education. I mean, it's inherent, right? You can't get away from it. There's massive power imbalances between, teacher, pupil, teacher down the hierarchy, parent, all sorts of issues with power probably. So again, I'd use the same kind of learning cycle and think, how is power operating in this department of school? Obviously, if you've got a problem with certain people really wanting power, then they're not necessarily going to be that open to this approach, but control what you can, and your classroom or whatever. Are we resorting to using power in ways that aren't actually that helpful? How are we empowering and including all people? Whose voices aren't we hearing? Who might be feeling more powerless? How is the hierarchy impacting? Obviously, you need a hierarchy and you need discipline. You can't get away from that. But actually, is there anything that's negative about that we could address? And how is disadvantage showing up? And how can we understand and really compassionately address this? I do the same for competition. Again, it's something that you can't get away from in education. Up to a point it needs to be there, but step back to reflect, which competitive behaviours do we want to foster? They're normal and healthy. Which ones do we not want to foster? Which ones do we need to address? What messages are we sending or modelling about failure? And are we promoting busy as a badge of honour at the expense of balance? We all do that a lot, I think. And are we actively valuing a range of attributes and abilities and ensuring that we notice everyone's efforts and their strengths and contributions? And then I do the same for compassion. So what threats are there for compassion at the moment? And what can we do to activate our soothing system? How might we use kindness, for example, to bring that system more aligned? And how can we adequately value and promote compassion and kindness, because this will help bring those other systems into balance and it will increase our performance. That's not why we do it, but for those people who doubt its worth, that's sometimes the angle that you need to go in with. And then I think for me, I mean, I guess I look back to my own education and think where it did and where it didn't prepare me. And I think it's really important that we equip young people with skills for life that include kind of, learning to just tune in and notice how they're feeling and what they need, and learning to label, validate, make sense of, and regulate emotions. So, just for your year 11s, I think it was Katie said, they're more stressed because they've not had this for a while. That's completely normal. And it's just a really great example of actually how, avoidance is anxiety's best friend, and how actually is much better when you're anxious to face things rather than avoid, because it makes it so much harder for us if we don't do that. Teaching them healthy coping skills, problem solving skills, teach them about boundaries, managing relationships, and also fostering that sense of the collective as well as the individual. But even just simple things like just appreciating that, when your stress goes up, your self-care needs to go up. It's just, I'm terrible at maths. That's the only equation I know. So, yeah. And I guess if, in an ideal world, it might be nice to think that leaders would commit to doing certain compassionate mind training themselves, but that's probably not always going to fly. So we have to find other ways in sometimes. But I think it's really important to think what we model and be really mindful of what we model. and to remember that sometimes when we slow down and consciously do less, we actually become more productive and more contented. So the target is not to think that, threat and drive are bad, but just to access this soothed, connecting, reflecting, caring state of mind, where we're also able to access a really healthy level of motivation and pleasure. It's a state of balance, really. But it's really genuinely hard for us to do that because we have tricky minds in a crazy world. But I would say just remember that process of trying is good for us and it's good for others.
Amazing. Oh, Lottie, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, so encouraging and so much wisdom. And I think definitely, if I was going to take one key nugget from that, it's definitely try and get into that soothe system, because even the process of trying is so beneficial. And yeah, I guess that is the opposite to the competition. It's like, woo, I'm in the soothe system, but actually it's much more the process of trying is huge. Oh my goodness, I enjoyed that conversation so much. Thank you very much for all the time and energy you put into learning so much and all that wisdom and experience you shared with us. That has been amazing.
No worries. I just wanted to say, I think there was some chat going on